transparent with that because it absolutely does happen to a lot of first responders I talk to. And the symbolism for just different things. It can be a wreck and chicken nuggets, right, spilled all over the floor because it represents the innocence of the children eating the chicken nuggets, or if it's connected to the family, their own family, or their own kids, and that attachment, right, or sometimes of self. If it's either reminds them of a loved one or of themselves.
Command, Engine 10, first line attack, making entry.
All right, Lona, it seems like it was just yesterday.
It does.
Well, welcome back. The first episode went so well, we had to do it twice.
Well, thank you.
So I appreciate you coming back, and we're just going to kind of more or less pick up where we left off.
Awesome.
Just to kind of recap, the last time that we were together and we were doing this podcast, we were talking about mental health and emergency services. And you have a very unique perspective, a professional, factual, truthful perspective on us, on emergency services. As far as we go, you're what I would refer to as a subject matter specialist. So thank you for being a part of this. You offer a very unique perspective that I think is going to be very informative for our subscribers and followers and everybody that watches the podcast. So thanks again.
You're so welcome, and I'm happy to.
You bet. All right. Well, let's dive on in here. So the last time we spoke, we were talking about mental health issues around the firehouse, and there were some communication aspects associated with some of that. So just to build on that, what are some communication skills that emergency services professionals can practice in their professional or even their personal settings, maybe even at home?
Well, let me start by saying this. The banter and the fun stuff that goes on, the trauma bonding, the dark sarcasm, the humor, I'm a fan of. I appreciate it.
Well, good. I'm glad that you are.
I definitely think it makes, a high stress situation fun and can be offloading. I think though that when I think the issue that it can become or can come from it is if someone starts to personally struggle, it can then be seen as triggers.
Okay.
Right? Because it can be one more thing on top of everything else that they're maybe taking on or dealing with that they may not be communicating.
Yeah, they've got some background stuff going on.
Yeah. So for those communication skills, it can be, like I said, the regular trauma bonding is effective and fun and good for the job. But then when people are struggling, it needs to be validating statements, which is the opposite of how we all talk, amongst each other.
Yes.
So it's very foreign, and it has to be a practice of validating somebody's feeling in the moment of which that they're struggling versus the banner that we can sometimes use.
I gotcha.
Among our population. So invalidating statements would be like ordering someone to feel differently or minimizing their experience or their feelings. Like I said, these are normal practices among first responders, but then can be self-sabotage in the relationships at home because now the kids or the spouses may feel like they're not connecting, like they don't have empathy, like they don't understand, like they don't care.
Yeah.
And so they can start on the family side, start to internalize it about themselves versus it being, a term of endearment at work.
Gotcha. So in emergency services, there's a lot of, it seems like a lot of emergency services employees have spouses that are in similar careers. Does that help in any way in the understanding of the way that the other might come across, or is that not usually the case?
It can go either direction, honestly, I would say. You can have those that can relate to each other and recognize when somebody may need space or when somebody's processing or maybe able to recognize the signs a little easier.
Okay.
Or it can be kind of just fire and gasoline, right? Because they're each bringing home something. If they're not communicating or processing, then it can erupt over alcohol or other factors or issues.
Okay.
So, but those communications, if we're practicing at our best self, right, as best communicators, and if we're doing the best of which we can, it would be to use like I messages instead of you messages.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is like, if you're coming to somebody with you, whether at the station or at home, and you're saying you always, you never, that activates the defense mechanism in the other person.
Okay.
So now they're shutting down. They're not hearing.
Because they're feeling like they're being attacked, basically.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. Versus if you say, I'm trying to understand, or I feel, or I need, or I'm trying to clarify, right? Clarifying statements are helpful instead of the assumptions, because assumptions can get us all in trouble.
Sure, absolutely.
But clarifying can help. Utilizing those I statements.
Okay.
And then active listening.
All right.
Because there's so many distractions. So if it's at work, obviously there's multiple distractions there. If it's at home, it may be phones, kids, social media, TV, gaming, other things to bring you away from maybe the conversations that need to happen.
So maybe under some circumstances like that, it would be good just to specifically set aside time to literally exclusively just to talk about what's going on.
To actually address it and sit with it.
Gotcha. Okay.
And undivided, right, attention and intentional attention with both people looking for solutions.
Yeah.
Right? Because people can circle the problem or the frustrations and the feelings, which we all have.
Yeah. But it never works towards a true solution and solves the problem.
But it has to be the solution focused.
Gotcha.
So a dynamic that can be utilized, like at the station, can be a team approach. So, as in the acronym TEAM. So focus on the topic, examine the options, assess pros and cons, and then make a decision.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
Otherwise, people can get hijacked on, anything or distracted with anything instead of actually having the conversation that they would be avoiding.
Right on. Yeah, and then you can't really, if you get distracted from it or something happens, I guess you never really get to the end result.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So in some of that, there might be some conflict in regards to the communication factor or others for that matter. So what are some conflict resolution skills that might help us, that we might be able to use in times where there's disagreements and we don't see eye to eye, whether it be, I guess, at work or maybe even at home too?
Right. So professionally, there can be multiple dynamics. So it can be high stress and cumulative stress from the calls that then can lead to conflict that are just projected onto each other. It can be rigid thinking or black or white thinking, or all or nothing thinking is another term for it, where instead of seeing the gray or both perspectives or multiple opportunities, it's just being in a fixed mind.
I feel like I've seen a lot of that in emergency services. Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
The all or nothing perspective.
Yes. And that's also defense mechanisms because things are able to be understood clearly if it's an A or B or black or white.
Okay.
Right? But what are relationships?
Yeah, they're not black or white.
They're everything
they're
gray.
Everything in between.
Which is why we can struggle. We may like and be highly effective in these careers, these high traumatic careers, but then struggle in the relational aspects because it is a lot of gray. It's not clear cut. There's a lot of movement, and some of those skill sets are collaboration or accommodation or cooperation. That has to happen for things to get done within the departments or at the home, So, but both people have to be willing to actually sit with that.
I gotcha.
And so that can be uncomfortable. And depending on attachment styles and personality styles, people may avoid that. If they're anxious or an avoidant attachment or they're introverted, they may have trouble communicating or expressing themselves.
So in terms of resolution, maybe as an approach, if there is some sort of a conflict, it would be good for that individual at work to set aside time with whoever the other individual is and have a calm discussion over whatever the situation may be, and both parties trying to reach a common goal of the solution.
Right.
Are there any other resolution factors that you'd suggest?
Really just having that conversation. I would be mindful and aware of, it's very easy and tempting to go to everybody else but the person it's about.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
And so within the departments, it's easy to vent and express and offload. But usually if it's not intentional or mindful, it's to other people that have no outcome or like ties to the solution. Right. So if it's directly with the person, then that can be resolved so that other people aren't getting in the mix, or like the drama unfolds behind the scenes
It sounds reminiscent of, just like gossip, basically.
Sure.
Okay.
Right. Because then there's assumptions, and just like what that telephone game, right? Being told to different people at some point, it's not going to come back as accurate as it was when it came out.
Yeah, when it started. I gotcha. Better to go direct to the source.
Right.
So, kind of switching gears a little bit, in fire and emergency services, especially the fire service, a lot of the guys and girls are very exercise driven, because it's a very physical aspect of the job. So, and then sometimes over time, some of that trickles off. But why is exercise such a great value to someone that's struggling with mental health?
I think for multiple reasons. It is the most underutilized antidepressant available. But again, it has to be utilized, right?
Yeah.
So for any male or female in the department, if I told them to, hey, be an effective first responder, but don't use the ambulance, don't use the right, don't use the fire truck, don't utilize any tools or apparatus or anything to help you, how effective are we going to be in those careers?
It's not going to work too well.
Right. Same thing for mental health and exercise. We can know what to do, but if we're not utilizing it, it also will be ineffective. So the beauty of it is oftentimes these careers do allow people to exercise, right? Even on the clock for a lot of organizations, and they can promote that. And emotionally and physically, right? They correlate and impact one another. So when we were talking about processing or releasing everything that the mind and cognitively and the body is absorbing in these fields, that is a physical way to exercise, to release
some of that aggression.
That aggression, the negative emotion, all of the calls that you can't control, all the things that you can't control, but it's also moving towards progress. And when you expend energy, you gain the energy, and you feel better about yourself, about your roles of which that you are within the profession as a person, and just as a whole, it can move you to a better direction.
Okay. Yeah, wow, that I didn't realize there were so many benefits to it. Yet another reason to get off the couch and work out, right?
True.
Absolutely.
They say there's a great analogy of as depression can't survive in movement.
Okay.
Right, and I like that concept, because if it's hard to be depressed if you're outside walking among the sun or at a park or you know what I mean? If you're out in nature and you're also working out or expending that energy, it's hard to not feel good at some point throughout making that change.
Yeah.
Now, say with depression, it's an official diagnosis, but we also get the choice of what we do with that. So a depressed person that's using avoidance can say, I'm depressed, so I can't get myself out of bed. I may, watch a sad movie. I may listen to a sad song. I may choose wine instead of, a healthier option. So what choices are they doing? They're feeding into the depression and using the depression as an excuse or a validation for that choice of behavior.
Okay.
And not to say that depression doesn't exist, but somebody that's actively working or managing their depression says, hey, I have depression, and because I have depression, I'm going to exercise or walk the dog or get outside or meet up with a friend for coffee instead of the wine or all these other alternatives.
Sure.
Right?
So,
that
so
manages and empowers versus enable somebody with depression.
So, okay. I gotcha. So and to go along with it, it sounds like just making conscious, effortful decisions to not just sit there and think about it.
Absolutely.
What is beneficial. But it sounds like but the exercise aspect of it sounds like it also has probably some physiological correlations too. I guess there's a dopamine release and all the things.
You got it.
So many different reasons. Okay.
Well, and recognizing too that exercise then brings you out of those. Remember we talked about in that first part one, the thoughts that lead to the feelings that lead to the behavior. So if you jump up and you exercise, it's bypassing right the thoughts and the feelings. You're going right to the behavior, right? Which then at some point will lift. So if you say only by thoughts, I wish or hope or want to be physically active or healthy. That's great intention, but without the active pursuit wellness that we talked about last time, the active pursuit of that physical well-being, you won't have movement, right? So you'll still be in that same place. So if you jumpstart and say, I'm just going to exercise without thinking about it, then you're bypassing your defense. You're taking action outside of the feeling, and then the feeling changes. So that's why after people work out, then they're like, "Wow, I feel good," right? They didn't. If you wait till the feeling to lead you to the behavior,
it's not going to happen.
It may not happen.
Yeah.
Ever happen, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But by taking the action outside of the feeling, that then can lead people into better spaces.
Okay.
Which is actually a dialectical behavioral therapy technique.
Okay.
So even for, let's say, somebody struggling with their job and they're feeling burnout or overwhelmed, by reframing things and saying I get to instead of I have to, now makes it a I get to position. And how do you serve when you get to versus you have to? Yeah,
it's definitely better received whenever you feel like you're doing it either by choice or by motivation rather than by demand.
Right. And same thing true, that would be a cognitive behavioral therapy technique by changing, reframing the thought and saying, I get to. Now that I get to, what do I want to do with that? Versus people that are maybe in a stuck feeling or overwhelmed or burnout and they're saying, I have to. Right? And they're doing everything resentfully.
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay. Makes sense. Very interesting. Well, I think those in the fire service would, and maybe the military too, be pretty inclined to maybe self-medicate a little bit with some weights.
Sure, absolutely.
That sounds very beneficial.
And it's good. A great one. I mean, and then it's personal goals, right? And then it's self-confidence, self-esteem, and that projects into all things.
So for those that, let's say they have been or always have or whatever worked out, does that mitigate some of those mental health issues in some cases? I mean, so obviously sometimes it's not.
Right.
But
I definitely think it helps with the management of, for sure. There's jokes, and shirts and all the clothing that says something about the gym is my psych ward.
Yeah.
And truly, right, it's a release and it's a discipline outside of whatever's going on in life, and it's a choice. But it's just like we had used the example of what is the thought that leads to the alcohol, because the alcoholic can validate and justify their use of it. Well, I have to live with you, or I have to work with you, or I deserve it, or I earned it. Same thing can be done with the positive, the adaptive coping skills, which is exercise. Well, I'm choosing me.
Yeah.
I'm going to work out.
Right.
I deserve to work out. I get to celebrate the movement of my body, right? Versus me having an ailment or, something that's keeping me from.
Yeah.
I have the ability to, which is why I should celebrate, right?
Yeah.
Versus condemn or shun or have a negative, outtake on body and self-worth.
Sure. Leads to definitely a better result. So on the topics of humor, there's a lot of humor, right? Or usually around the station, a lot of jokes being played and stuff like that. So how do you think humor and laughing and stuff like that can be used as a tool for promoting mental health, even around the fire station or at home, and well-being?
I definitely think it's a healthy adaptive skill set. I engage in it as much as possible. I love it. I have fun with it.
Yeah.
I appreciate people that can utilize humor. It can lighten things no matter what's going on.
Absolutely.
Whether it's within the profession and all the calls or the trauma that people are being exposed to. It can be life transitions. It's almost like a dopamine hit of hope and release and fun and lightheartedness, right? Despite anything that may be going on.
Right. So more reason to find the humor in everything that you can, I guess, huh?
Absolutely.
So what you're saying is we need to play more practical jokes around the station?
I mean, I'm definitely a fan within reason, right? We don't want to upset the Chiefs
Don't
or the
make the Chiefs mad.
but definitely that, right? Because that builds a fun and connective culture. Like even on a deeper
completely
level,
agree
right?
with it.
So it breeds a fun, like, lighthearted, trusting culture when you can have that humor and those practical jokes
Absolutely
involved.
Yeah. It makes you look forward to work more too,
Right.
to know that, hey, I'm going to go to work today and we usually have fun or whatever,
Right.
versus I'm going to go to work today, I'm going to run some horrible calls and everybody's going to be depressed and
Right.
sit on the couch.
Absolutely.
The other definitely sounds a lot better.
Yeah.
So the last time that during episode 1, when we spoke with you the first time, you were talking about EMDR.
Yes.
And that is a very in-depth subject, and it seems to be kind of a cutting edge. Would you call it a therapy?
Therapy
A cutting edge therapy for those that have experienced a traumatic event of some sort or another. Can you kind of continue on that topic as far as EMDR, or if there's any other current research or developments in the field of mental health that are particularly new, exciting, promising, and that sort of thing? I know EMDR was one of those topics.
Absolutely. So it's nothing. I encourage people to look it up and even go in depth with it, even more so after this or being exposed to it. There's only certain therapists that are trained in it. So even as we went to be trained in it, I had to be the client before I was the clinician.
Okay.
And I'll be very transparent and honest, as I am with everybody on this. I had heard all of the amazing research and good stuff with it. And I wanted to know, especially for our population, if it is real and good and true. I wanted to know. And if I felt it wasn't, I also wanted to know that. So I went and was in the mindset, if I need to debunk it, I'll debunk it, right?
Yeah.
Let's challenge this.
Let's see how it works. Yeah.
And amazing stuff.
Okay.
Right? Because the brain subconsciously stores these events and these and trauma, and we experience it in a way, in a high aroused crisis, in a state. So to simplify it, it's almost like the expression has been used, if you take a file cabinet and you dump it over, and everything is just scattered. If somebody's going through their life like that, or going through a traumatic event that is hijacking like their cognitive skills and their thinking and multiple, symptoms, then it can help to almost like it just organizes and places every file in place. It makes sense of things to where things aren't as overwhelming, and it desensitizes, right? EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and then the reprocessing is the final step.
Okay.
So it's taking that traumatic call and it's isolating that event, and then you're asking yourself what that negative core belief surrounding that event is. I was helpless. I'm broken, whatever that is. And then it's saying, where in your body did you experience that? On a scale from 0 to 10, how disturbing is that? What emotions are tied to that, labeling the emotions with that event. And then at some point it's reprocessing to where it's organizing, you're processing through image by image, until at the end it's reprocessing with, if it was, the negative core belief was I am helpless, it's now that I'm actually helpful, or I helped in the best of which I was able. And there were all these other external circumstances outside of me that maybe led that person to not make it or to be deceased or whatnot. Okay. But it kind of finalizes things for everybody. So it's amazing clarity for anything, any kind of trauma. Again, though, people have to be willing to sit with it. And I think that's the hardest barrier, is you're asking somebody to sit with maybe the most gut-wrenching or vulnerable time in their life or call in their life, something that profoundly impacted them.
And relive it, basically.
And relive it. But it's definitely in a controlled setting, and everybody at the end is saying, you know, I feel relief once you finally sit with it. Because there is resolve that comes from you internally to navigate that negative core belief to a positive, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the reprocessing part. Okay. So you can have people, and it can be suicides of loved ones that they've witnessed or anything like that they've done.
Goodness, yeah.
And heavy ones.
Yeah, that sounds pretty tough.
And at the end, it's still resolved, recognizing there's these external factors beyond them that they don't have to carry whatever that load is that they've been struggling with. Okay. And so that reprocessing kind of sets it in motion to where now it's not, even when they think of the image or the event, it's not as intense because it's been desensitized. Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's pretty interesting. I've had some correlations like that myself over my career where I don't know what the correct clinical term would be for it, but, you know, just an image of some sort, something that's just, I would say, you know, burned into your memory, something awful, horrible. And then it kind of pops into your head and your heart rate, you know, goes up, your palms get sweaty, you get nervous, and that's what, so is that kind of what you're talking about?
Well, and these images are these memories or these events, right, that we've been exposed to or have had either professionally or personally, they can flood you like within your body. Right. Okay. So where you can feel like you're losing control emotionally, you know, or physically, with either from senses, from smells, from sights, from sounds, from external, you know, triggers that then can flood the body and the mind with past events.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, absolutely. There was a period of time that the sound of a helicopter or the smell of certain things would remind me. On a previous episode, I think Bella Media did an interview on me and asked me some questions. I think I brought this up the last time we talked. And the correlation with that was that there were, because of all of the pediatric fatalities that I made in such a short period of time, it was close to Christmas, so there's Christmas presents there at every full arrest, every fatality. There was even one that was out in the middle of a field.
Right.
And a car flipped over, and there were Christmas presents because they had just gone Christmas shopping. So then, fast forward to Christmas Eve, and my kids at the time are opening their Christmas presents, and I could not handle it.
Yep.
I mean, it was bad.
Right.
I mean, almost, I would compare it to an anxiety attack or something like that. I had to excuse myself, you know.
Well, and I thank you for being so courageous and transparent with that, because it absolutely does happen to a lot of first responders I talk to, and the symbolism for just different things. It can be a wreck and chicken nuggets, right, spilled all over the floor because it represents the innocence of the children eating the chicken nuggets, or if it's connected to the family, their own family, you know, or their own kids, and that attachment, right, or sometimes of self. If it's either reminds them of a loved one or of themselves, whatever the call may be. And so that can be, you know, a struggle. As well. And so I'm so glad that you addressed it and that you're honest with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I myself, in order to get through that, I went through some, I guess I'd call it alcoholism. I didn't feel like an alcoholic at the time, but I was drinking way too much.
Sure.
And, but counseling helped me get through that.
Yeah.
So, and now I don't drink nearly as much as I used to.
Yeah.
So.
And here's one thing too, just for maybe veterans within the first response world, or even for the new hires. I think one thing that first responders get stuck on is the replaying of the suffering.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that for sure.
So what I tell people that can help sometimes move them is you're grieving and the loss and the suffering of the person and patient you attempted to help.
Mm-hmm.
But after you've left that call in just real direct terms, one of two things has happened. One, that person is gone and passed and no longer with us, which means they're no longer in pain.
Okay.
Or two, they're moving through their recovery, whatever that is. Whether it was a burn victim, whether it was somebody learning to walk again, maybe it was somebody moving forward in their life and getting married and have overcome whatever circumstance they were in.
Yeah.
Either way, in either outcome, they're no longer suffering.
Right. It's the realization that it's not happening right this second.
Correct.
Right now, basically, is what you're saying. It sounds like.
But the mind will relive it.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And
it
connect
feels
back
like
to
it's
it,
happening.
and it feels right.
Okay.
Right.
Very interesting. Anything on, I know we also talked about, was it CBT and DBT?
Mm-hmm. So CBT is that cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's learning to catch and correct and reframing our thoughts.
Gotcha.
Because our thoughts can lead to our feelings and then lead to our behaviors, we have to be mindful and intentional with our thoughts. So even asking somebody, who told you that? You know, sometimes I'll ask a client, who told you that? And it's either coming from self or it came from maybe somebody else in their childhood that they've rehearsed and replayed back to themselves in their adulthood.
Interesting.
Which now in present day, it's them taking that on and doing that to themselves.
Okay.
Because it's been rehearsed within their own mind.
Yeah, they keep thinking about it. Okay.
And then the DBT is taking that action outside of the feeling, because sometimes it may become too hard to catch and correct your own thinking, or you may get stuck within the thought, or like hyperfixation or OCD or things like that. So it may be taking action outside of the feeling, right? Because it may be too hard to reframe the thought in the moment.
I gotcha.
So it may be like, okay, now what? Do I need to distract? Do I need to take action and distract myself?
Okay.
With something else.
Yeah.
Right. And then of course exercise is a good one because, right, going back to that one, but, or is it a healthy hobby, or is it, you know, meeting up with a friend that's going to distract you from just feeding the thought? But without action, it's just feeding the.
I gotcha. It just pulls you back in.
Pulls it. Yeah. Right.
Unless you take some sort of physical action to distract you, basically, it sounds
right.
like.
And a healthy adaptive versus the maladaptive way.
Yeah. Very interesting. Any other topics as far as like, you know, cutting edge stuff or stuff? It sounds like what you were first talking about is really interesting. So you're a licensed practitioner of this particular therapy. Are there many other people that do that?
There are. They have to go and be trained in addition to their master's degree. So it's a different certification and different training. So it's extra hours, extra money for the clinician. But like I said, we strongly have utilized it with our first responders and seen great outcomes. So we invest in it at our practice. And then two, just another thought while we're on different mechanisms and helpful skill sets is also guided imagery.
Okay.
And so first responders can use guided imagery in different ways. So that compartmentalize in the first part one, we mentioned that y'all tend to use dissociation, compartmentalization, and minimalization as defense mechanisms and skills for this career. Yeah. So guided imagery can be another helpful skill set for that offloading and coping. So it can be saying, for example, if you go on a call, you may have done everything within your power within that call, and whatever door, either closing out the apartment or the door to their home, and being mindful and intentional of that, or getting into an ambulance or a fire truck, you can be closing off and saying, I've done everything within my role in this moment for this patient. Now I'm closing it up and not taking it back to the station with me.
Leaving it behind.
leaving it behind. So just guided imagery to help offload. Or for example, in the transition home. So you can use a garage door. If you're pulling into the garage door, it may be, I'm now closing my roll off as a first responder. Now I'm stepping into my role as a
husband or a father,
spouse and a parent.
Okay.
Yep. Absolutely. Even the same thing in the shower, right? You at the station or at home, you may wash the call off for the day, or the ones that may be tempted to stick and cross over. It may be getting in the shower and physically saying, I'm letting, and consciously saying, I'm letting this call go. Right?
So it helps to have like a physical correlation of some sort?
Right.
Okay.
And here's another one, mechanism for the thought, to get rid of thoughts. For kids, it may be attach the thought to a balloon and imagine yourself letting it go. For anybody else, it can be a drone. It can be a bird if you're sitting outside. It can be another car in front of you if you're driving down the street. But that mindfulness and guided imagery can be helpful just to help with transitions and closing those thoughts out.
Very interesting.
And calls out.
So maybe as you close off a shift, as you're leaving shift and you walk out to your truck or your car, you sit in the driver's seat for a second and go through this correlation, and it kind of helps you leave some of those traumas or that part of who you are. Right. Leave it behind and move forward. Right.
It's practicing the off-duty processing, right? And so the more of which you can release and process that, the less, the rate of the cumulative stress will build up.
Can you also do that with traumatic events, like a specific trauma?
Yes.
Or is there a point where like those physical traumas become too traumatic to where you have to do more than just the visualization of closing it off, or does it work for most things?
Well, and it depends on every person and individual, but I think I would practice the guided imagery on the daily.
Okay.
On specific heavy traumatic calls, ones that are unique, right? Outside of the realm of our norm traumas, right? If that's even a thing.
Yeah, the normal bad stuff.
Right, yeah. All the ones that we excuse or minimize or give correlation or cause and we offload. But the ones that may be tempted to cross over, those may need a debriefing, and then those may need, if somebody's still struggling,
absolutely, they
may need counseling for their own self through it, or they may need to do EMDR to just release it.
So it could definitely be a multifaceted solution, I guess.
Yeah.
But it sounds like this is something that, as I understand it, it would be good regular practice to say, I'm leaving this behind.
Yes.
I gotcha.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. So to switch gears a little bit, we haven't talked about your personal faith much yet, but has your faith helped you in your mission to help others and what you're doing? Because this has got to be hard for you too.
Sure.
That you're listening to all of this on such a regular basis from so many people. I could imagine that conversationally, you've been through more traumatic calls than any of us.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, so there's, and for clinicians, there's secondary trauma exposure, right, that we have to be mindful of too. And that's where I say it's like a care of, right, a curriculum of care, right, and of support for all of us in these fields. Because from the person, the ones running the calls to processing the calls to then processing the processing of calls. So we as therapists may get counseling or offload at times to process out some of the ones that cross over. We too have to manage our own selves because there can be cumulative stress from our end as well. But working with those, it absolutely can, be cumulative just as much with the secondary trauma and the exposure. But with the faith base of that is one way to help offload. Starting this career, I had to take a leap of faith to start this business years ago.
Yeah.
I went from a stable salary to jumping on faith And it literally was, God, I feel this calling and I hope you catch me,
Yeah.
And it started honestly with one department, and it has been a blessing. It has been inter referrals, and, it's grown through the trust, through people knowing that we're looking out for them in their best interest. And no matter what they bring or what we hear, we still can value them as a person and still see them and respect them and have, the courage for them that it took for them to get there. And I've seen amazing people do amazing things, through their own pain. And that faith is what led to the name Grace and Guidance, because
I was wondering if that was the case.
Yeah. Because, as we were choosing the name, I think that grace is unique and undeserving, and it's given and provided, even at times when we don't need it, or we always need it, but maybe don't deserve it. Right?
Gotcha.
And so I think that people can reach out finally at their hardest point or their breaking point. And then the guidance is utilizing the therapeutic techniques to help them, empower them to walk through it. Because myself, I don't have the power to always change their circumstance, but I do truly believe that if people don't have to walk alone, they can get through anything. It's when people feel alone or they isolate and become alone that it can become too much.
I agree with you completely.
And so that's where the name came about from the faith, was if it's with Grace and Guidance, either one or both, however we can get through to people and help them through, that's what we're willing to do,
Yeah, absolutely. I know my faith's played a big role in just being able to make it through my career.
Sure.
We, years ago, you know how it was. The demand for the need for people like yourself and organizations like yours, it wasn't met.
No.
And in some ways, I think some people tried, but it was just such an overwhelming need that it just become unmanageable in many cases. So, and in my case, there just wasn't many outlets at the time of my career, and without that faith, I don't know if I would have made it.
And I agree with that. That, even like what you're saying, that's still a gap, right? I think that's one that our practice addresses. But there is a gap. So there was the options, there's EAPs, there's other counselors, there's check boxes, right? Even when departments are trying to provide something versus nothing, is still progress, but there were still gaps. So if people were reaching out, and it takes for any helper in the community for them to get to a place of which they're willing to ask for help or sit with help. It takes a lot.
Really bad.
Yeah. Usually we've done everything behind the scenes that we probably shouldn't until we're finally like, fine, fine, here I am.
Absolutely.
But with that, if they were reaching out and it was like an EAP counselor that had they're not trauma informed.
Yeah. They didn't know what.
They don't have the resiliency in themselves to hear all the cumulative stress and secondary trauma. Or two, they didn't even understand the lingo or the dynamics. There could be breakdowns along the way.
Yeah.
Or, by the time they do reach out, we typically need faster services.
Yeah.
And quality services.
Sure.
And people that we meet with and can form a rapport of trust and, dialogue.
Yeah.
So they were reaching out, and then it would be, unfortunately, just relayed. I would hear horror stories of they're like, they didn't get it.
They didn't know what they were going through. Yeah.
And so they may, even the dialogue or the acronyms, or somebody's using the lingo and they say, we loaded up the box, and that EAP counselor may be thinking a physical box, a cardboard box.
Yeah.
So they're not even
they're not thinking of an ambulance. They're not thinking of the medic unit at
right?
all. Mm-hmm.
So even some of the dialogue itself can be missed without any kind of information. So with Grace and Guidance, and then also we rebranched and also extended to Aspire and Acquire to train counselors to make sure that they're trauma informed and also first responder friendly, and to know, right, have the background and the knowledge to effectively serve them. So that's been another route that we've taken to try to kind of fill in gaps if at all possible, and do it with good services.
Absolutely.
Which at times are still lacking in other places, even with good intention.
Yeah. And, I'm sure there is a lot of good intention with some of those EAP programs, but it's almost like there's such, like I was saying, the demand is so high and the attention is so unique. It's just, it falls short unless, they're talking to somebody and working with somebody that, like yourselves and your organization, that really understands what's going on.
Right.
So, and the demand is so high, and it has been for so long. It's just, we talk about taking care of ourselves physically.
Yeah.
But nobody really before ever really talked about taking care of yourselves psychologically, emotionally, intellectually. Go to school, you run calls, you work out, that's all you got to do. But that's not enough.
Right. And
it's not enough to sustain a career.
You're right. And that's what we were seeing. That was one of those gaps that we were mentioning, because at some point that falls short and is not enough. So it was that off-duty processing piece of when's the emotional intelligence also going to come in, and when are the resources going to come in to say that not only can we normalize all of this for our population, but then to encourage it and support it? Because if we are all addressing it, and like I said, the whole continuum, so even counselors, trauma counselors, they have to offload. The whole continuum, if we're all being accountable with that, then we can all be progressing and making movement, in the right direction for everyone, right?
Yeah.
And helping everybody through. And I say this too, even on peer supports, it doesn't matter your stage of healing. You can still be of help, right? So no matter what life event or what stage of healing that somebody is in themselves, just by sitting with someone else or using their own story for pain for purpose, or, a trial, for a testimony, you still can be of help. And look at all the examples in the faith-based, look at all the examples in the Bible of which that they utilized, ordinary people, right? For extraordinary things.
Extraordinary things.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I have a question about, so we haven't really talked much about PTSD. However, I would assume that most people that are watching this understand that there is a lot of that goes into this. But specifically on that topic, so let's say, and alcohol plays a big role, as we've talked about, I think in the first episode, as maybe touched on at this episode too, that alcohol is kind of an underlying thing too in emergency service, quite frequently, very common. So let's say somebody is seeking counseling in regards to the PTSD, but maybe they also have some alcoholism or some alcohol underlying problems.
Right.
Do you typically address the alcoholism first? Do you address the patient's post-traumatic stress disorder first?
Right.
Do you do it both at the same time? How does that work? Because I feel like those are very common things that work together.
Oh yeah, for sure. And inpatient facilities can do co-disorders, right, where they're addressing them simultaneously, right?
Okay.
And so that's when they're going in and people are having intense work for the alcoholism and maybe PTSD or another diagnosis.
For a dual
diagnosis.
Purpose.
Yep.
Okay.
In the therapeutic setting, it depends on, we can hit both. We can also, it's depending on the severity or if it's moderate. If it's severe, if it's too severe, then I may then say, hey, you need to address the alcoholism. I'm saying they're finding themselves, they're drinking or we have suspicion they're showing up drunk. Okay. Or they're staying in the parking lot drinking or leaving or still actively, having an active addiction, even with a DWI and all these factors, right? So they're not making changes or being accountable. They're still self-sabotaging with the addiction itself. If they're under the influence, they're not going to be able to, the active influence, they're not going to be able to utilize the therapeutic coping skills.
Makes sense.
right? Because they're hijacked. The alcohol's doing what it's supposed to do, but until they're imploding with their own self-sabotaging behavior. So the alcohol will numb it, or create a defense that won't allow the true coping skills to be utilized and take place.
Okay.
Right. Versus if somebody's sober.
Yeah, they're able to process conscious thought more logically. Right.
Sure. And for anyone, right, the intensity of emotion can become heated with alcohol. The just anger, right, can come out. Frustrations. It can be projected in a way with alcohol that maybe a sober person or mind would not.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And making better choices for themselves when they are choosing the coffee, over,
over alcohol
you
or
name it.
Drugs of some sort or another. I say alcohol, and I know that, you've probably seen variations of addiction.
Yeah.
It just seems to me, I guess, that alcohol just seems to be really common. So.
And even just in kind of how it transpires, if we have somebody they have been sober and then they fall off the wagon or have a relapse, typically they'll because of the embarrassment or because of their own shame or guilt or through the act of addiction, they may kind of fall off the wagon, and then they may cancel their appointment or they may stop showing up. And so we even, being informed, we will even reach out and say, hey, where are you at? We still got you. If things are, going south or you're struggling, we still got you. We're still here for you, Now we can't make them or force them or anything like that. But we are even mindful to, reach out to them and saying, hey, there's still non-judgment. We just want you to be actively working on yourself. So,
yeah. Just want what's in their best interest.
Yeah.
So for our audience, can we go through some signs and symptoms specifically for the family members of first responders and military personnel that, sometimes I know personally, and you've probably seen similar, that sometimes the individual going through the problem doesn't self-recognize as quickly or as easily as family does. Can we walk through that from a family perspective real quick, just about, what signs and symptoms, would a family member look for in their first responder or military personnel, and how do they follow that? How do they start that conversation of you need help without the you, right?
Without the you. There you go. There's that communication style. And unfortunately, frustrations can build where it's like you this, you that, you that. And with any mental health or any addiction, unfortunately, that can bring the guard up, the defense up, versus saying, hey, why don't we try, or I would like to try this, or I would like to go to an AA meeting with you, or I would like to go to church with you, or I would like to us look up, read this book, start this chapter book together. The inclusiveness, right? That's a different story and statement if they're being helpful and supportive. Now, again, it still falls on the person that's struggling, to be accountable. They still have to choose it for themselves. But the support has to come with ease, unless they become a harm to themselves or others, right? And then at that point, that's different.
Okay.
But two, I think the marriages and the families are the accountability partners, so they typically do see it first.
Seems like it.
And unfortunately, it's usually the last people that people want to hear from.
Yeah.
Right?
It's hard.
So,
I would imagine it's very difficult, especially from a spouse that's I don't want to make them sound estranged, but from a spouse that's not in emergency services, or from a spouse that's hasn't been in the military, maybe it's harder to identify and deal with. So.
And then vice versa too. There's so many dynamics to our marriages and to our families that there's so much crisis that y'all are handling on the job, but then those that are at the house, they still may be doing a lot around that. They may be working, they may be taking care of the kids, they may be fixing things or not wanting to burden the first responder with these other things, or their needs may not be getting met, within the home, and not communicated, or feel as though that they're not important in comparison to their first responder spouse. So there's even those dynamics that can play where people will stop communicating or shutting down or turning to other things or means or,
So maybe if from a family perspective, maybe if they're seeing changes in behavior, isolation, it sounded like maybe isolation was a big one. Some sort of an addiction, I would imagine, of some sort or another.
Disengagement from the family.
Any like anger type stuff? Any like angry outbursts?
Absolutely.
Or
and it can
anything
be
like that?
Absolutely. It can be projected. We had mentioned like the projection can be on things or people.
Okay.
It may be micromanaging at the house or the family members. It may be hyperfixating on a cup that's left out, and then the explosion happens over a cup.
Okay.
Right.
Gotcha.
For the release, or it may be physical or aggressive behaviors, or throwing things, or, holes in the walls, or whatever that may be externally.
And then these examples, these would be acharacteristic type behaviors?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Out of the ordinary
Out
for
of the
the
ordinary.
individual. Okay. I gotcha.
The hiding of, maybe finding the bottles, maybe the increase of, so there'll be a hiding and secretive, lack of transparency. So those things can start to become signs for any.
That they're trying to hide something
They're trying
of
to
some
hide
sort or
something.
another. The alcohol or maybe the addiction or something like that.
Right.
Okay. So, and again, from the family's aspect, from the family side, let's say their first responder or maybe their spouse or whoever comes home from a military deployment, and it was hard. You know that it was a bad shift. It was a bad deployment. They went through some stuff. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations for family to work with that? Because they're in, such close proximity at home. Do you have any recommendations of what they could do to help?
There's definitely a transition and re-engagement. So that re-engagement, if the spouse that was at the house, that then probably became their domain while they were deployed. And then this person coming home can be feeling all kinds of emotions, maybe now a disconnect or lack of purpose, or, confusion and anger and alcoholism and things like that can start to manifest within the home in that transition. So the spouse at the house there's patience and empathy, right, that would need to be involved. And then also preventatives, just recognizing, hey, this may be a new chapter or a new external problem that we as a couple have to face. And we need to attack that instead of attacking each other.
Okay.
During that re-engagement piece and phase.
Okay. I gotcha. If they know that it was a bad shift or a bad deployment, should the family member ask about it? Should they encourage the responder, the military personnel to talk about it?
Yes.
Or do you not advise that?
Yes, and they get to decide what level.
Okay.
I think they just have to be accountable and own it. So if the first responder is saying, hey, I'm coming home, it was a harder shift than normal, or I had a pediatric call, right? Even if it only is at that extent, now the spouse or the kids can readjust, right? So if the spouse had a chore list for you to do right when you got home, maybe she can wait to your second or third day off, right?
Yeah.
When she knows it was a harder shift. If she doesn't know, then she can't, assume or predict or to know to be effective.
Yeah. So communication.
Yeah. And obviously then depending on the spouse and the marriage, like I would be able to hear stuff and be fine, because it's also like the job that I do, but somebody else may not want to hear anything or details or not have that exposure, which is why I say if they just acknowledge that it was a harder shift, then the spouse can still accommodate, right? There's that right, conflict resolution, accommodate on the backside for that first responder coming home.
Okay. All right.
And vice versa, right? Because sometimes it's not communicated what the spouse at home, is doing with their work, their kids,
maybe they had a bad day.
Maybe they had a bad day, right? And it is a lot but they may not be communicating that as well.
Okay. So we're coming up on our hour, and I've got two things. The first one being probably a really significant how to advise people to take action. So suicide is really significant, and it's becoming more statistically significant. And the first responders aspect, according to statistics anyways. If an emergency services personnel's watching this right now and they're having thoughts of hurting themselves or someone else, what would you say to that person, and what could they do right now to help?
First of all, you're not alone. You're not alone. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people struggling behind the scenes. So definitely recognizing that you're not alone. Building that support system, having an accountability partner right away so that they're not doing it alone. Reaching out to a therapist for them to process that, to see what's going on. An emergency contact could be the 988, right? Text that if wherever they are, they could also reach out to that national hotline.
What was it again?
988.
988. Okay.
And so that's available for anybody. If anybody's suicidal, it would be to remove the means, right? Because people can have suicide ideations, but it's the means to act.
Okay.
So it's removing any means. If they're thinking about overdosing, they need to remove the pills from the house. If they're thinking about using a gun, they in that moment need to take, again, once they get back to their selves and their best self, those may not be a trigger or a thought.
Okay.
Right? Anymore. Yeah. But in the moment, remove the means.
Okay. All right.
During a suicide ideation.
Gotcha. So, lastly, so I'd like to talk about end on a positive note, right? How can gratitude help people through some of these times and trying to stay positive and trying to avoid, having some of these suicidal ideations and the other symptoms that we discussed? How does gratitude play a role in that?
I think a big one.
Yeah.
I think if we're utilizing the skill set, I think we all have something to be grateful for.
Absolutely.
I think, unfortunately, we live in such a fast-paced, instant gratification, settings in society that we can minimize our gratitudes.
Absolutely.
And we can all take things or people for granted. But despite anything that people are going through, there still is something to be grateful for. So by practicing opening and closing the day with gratitude can also reframe, right? And realign us back to what really matters.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the things may not matter in a day, a week, or 2 months, or a year. We may not even remember what was bothering us that day.
Yeah.
Right? But we all do have something to be grateful for. We get to do this job. We get to, have this opportunity that maybe will reach somebody that it speaks to.
Absolutely.
We get to have these roles and to serve.
Absolutely. That's awesome. I appreciate you. I've still got so many more questions that I want to ask. I really feel like your mission and our mission they are parallel. So maybe again sometime in the future,
absolutely,
we could have you back on and we can ask you another million questions.
Sure. But hey, we're in it together.
Absolutely. So. And I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your patience and your understanding and breaking this stuff down. I think that we're moving things forward as far as mental health goes. We have to take more of an active stance in mitigating some of this stuff. Some of it might not even be avoidable in our profession, but one way or the other, we've got to deal with it because it's affecting all of us. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. And kudos to your department for being proactive with mental health and then for the mission that you're doing here with First Line. So
I appreciate it. And we enjoy all the amazing stuff that you do for us.
Thank you.
You help our employees quite a bit. So absolutely. If anybody watching this hasn't looked up Grace and Guidance, I would tell you that they are an indisposable asset to any fire emergency services organization. I don't know many people that do this. I wish that it was something that you could just, look out the front door and find, or look out the front of the firehouse and find it. But man, nobody does what you guys do. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on the show, Lona.
Thank you.
Have
Appreciate
a good
it.
one.
You too.
Command, Engine 10, first line attack, making entry.